time. And I started fishing in Montauk in, I think it was 1988 or 89. A friend of mine, Jeff Newman, was a good friend of mine. He was a drummer, actually, and he was a guy I played with in a band, and I actually ran into him at Field 2 at Robert Moses one night at like midnight during a northeast storm, and within a couple of weeks we were fishing together a lot, and he said, you gotta come out to Montauk, man. You gotta get out here. You gotta get out. You gotta get out. And my first trip out was around Halloween of, I think, 89 or something, and we walked into the south side, and I saw something that I had just never seen before, and it was fish exploding on bait like I had never seen before. When I got there, my heart stopped, man. I mean, I was completely smashed just by looking at it. And we went down and threw pencil poppers at them, and we just clobbered them all day long. They weren't big fish. There was more bluefish than there was bass. And, you know, everybody says the heyday this, the heyday that. Most of the fish weren't that big. But we had a ton of them, and that was probably the most fun I ever had. And once I had that weekend in me, I was hooked. I had to be out here all the time, man. Had to happen. So I just started coming out every weekend. You know, at that time I was living in Bayshore, and you know, it used to take us an hour and 20 minutes most of the time. You know, we do quick runs after work. We do quick shots on the weekend and sleep in the station wagon. Get a Ford Country Squire station wagon, and we would park in the lower lot. And he would always sleep underneath the car in a sleeping bag, and I always had the back seat. Consequently, my legs would always be completely cramped the next morning or in the middle of the night whenever we decided to fish. But it was love at first sight, man. It was crazy. It was great. It really was. Years ago, John DeMalis decided that he was going to put the shop up for sale, and he had it up, he had it on the market, and my brother-in-law Vinny actually saw it before I did. And my idea was that the two of us could go in as partners and become partners and buy the place. He decided he was just going to quit his job flat out and take the place over by himself because he didn't really want, and you know, I don't blame him. You know, he didn't want to have a partner, which would just be something that, you know, you don't really need most of the time. So Vinny wound up buying the place from John, and he did about 6 years of it, and he just got exhausted because this business will knock you unconscious on your ass after a couple of years. He didn't want to do it anymore. So when he decided to get out, I said, you know, maybe now it's time to make my move. I was a union construction worker at the time, and I had to make a change. I just couldn't do it anymore. My back was shot, my legs were shot, my hips were shot, my elbows were done, my shoulders were completely gone from pushing up in the air all day like anybody else knows who does it for a living. And I had a shot, so I took it. You know, it was my time to really become somebody that I wanted to be. You know, I didn't have to worry about raising kids and all of the money that I was making as a union construction worker, because we were making good money then, in the 80s and 90s, obviously. And then through 2006, we were still pretty busy. But after that, it just got a little tired, and I had to get out. And I needed to get out, and I had just had a shot at the shop, so I took it. I took my chance, you know. I already knew what I wanted to do with the shop. I was already building rods. I had been building rods for, at that point, about, gee whiz, probably 20 years by that time, you know. And I learned everything by dissecting John Shower's rods, because John Shower was the guy you went to when you lived out where we lived. Big John was always a great guy, and he still is to this day, now that he's down in Florida. He was an inspiration to me, you know, and it wound up working out. My typical day starts with usually waking up in the camper 9 times out of 10, because I don't go home very often. I actually live in Islip, and I basically stay in my camper most of the time. My day starts pretty early, probably around 4:30 or so, and my first order of duty is always put on a pot of coffee, because without the pot of coffee you can't get anything done. I got to go through the day's rigmarole, and you know, I have to see what rods I got to finish, what reels I have to finish, what kind of orders I have to put together, what kind of dock I have to just install on the shelves because there's always boxes of stuff in my shop. When people walk in my shop, I'm sure they see boxes everywhere, and they probably think that I'm not doing anything with these boxes of things, but the truth is I just can't stay awake late enough to put everything on the shelf. So I have to start pretty early in the morning. You figure from 4:30, I get started then. I start setting my rods and reels up. If I have Paulie Monntauk coming in to help me, I have work set up for him. And, you know, it just involves a lot of time just to get set up. I don't open till 7. I used to open at 6, but I found that opening at 6 o'clock was losing an hour of valuable time that I could have to make sure that I could get things done before customers started showing up. And I found that between 6 and 7, not a lot of guys showed up anyway. So I open at 7 o'clock. And by 7 o'clock, I try to have everything ready to go, and I try to have everything ready to just be set up for the guys that are going to be coming in. The night crew is going to be either coming in off the beach, or they're going to be just waking up, and they're going to be ready to replenish, go back up to the light, sleep in their trucks, and get ready to go. So it's more just preparing for rod and reel repair than it is anything else, other than, you know, for the guy, because you never know who's going to walk in. You never know what happened the night before if you weren't out there. You know what I mean? So it's just a lot of preparation that everything you have to do. You have to get ready for the day. And then, you know, it goes until about 6 when I usually close. And I go about another 2 hours, maybe 3 after that. So my day starts at about 4:30 and ends at about 9 at night, you know. It's a long day. You know, I know a lot of surfcasters always say, oh, I'm tired. Believe me, brother, you're not as tired as I am, man. I think the most challenging part of my job is actually helping novice surfcasters actually try to catch fish, because there's a lot of things written in magazines and spilled out onto the internet that you just come to Montauk with one of Don Mosso's daughters and you catch a 50-pound fish, and it just doesn't work that way. You really have to work at it, and convincing these people that you actually have to stand in the water and cast after cast after cast and after cast to catch a fish is something that's very difficult to explain to somebody who's really not that experienced. I think that's the hardest thing, because a lot of guys just want to come out and catch big fish, but it's not that simple. And to try to explain to them what kind of time you have to actually put in to the game before you can produce is very difficult. It's very difficult to explain to them that you can't just stand in the water, take 3 casts, and catch a 50. It just doesn't work that way. You have to explain to them how hard it really is to catch a big fish. The easy part is sending them out into a blitz in the daytime with pencil poppers, because a lot of guys think that the only way to fish is to throw pencil poppers at fish that are boiling all over. And that's the easiest part of the game. It's not difficult at all. The hardest part of that is not crossing over somebody's line when he's hooked up. And that's another part that's very difficult to explain, how you have to watch. If another guy is hooked up, you can't just start casting over his line. But the hard part is convincing people that it's not that easy. That's the hard part. A lot of guys think that the bite actually starts in September, when the reality is, I mean, by like April 20th, we usually have our first keepers over at Ditch Plains. Early spring is always dynamite. From Ditch back into like Cavitt's Cove. I don't know why it starts at Ditch. The structure is there, but it's not anything that's as drastically different as anywhere else. But for whatever reason, when the fish start circling and coming up, the first spot is always Ditch. Small bucktails and small plastics will always take fish there in the spring. Figure by April 20th usually. By the 18th usually there's a keeper. Years ago, the bass used to get here before the bluefish, but in I've noticed the last about 10 years, the bluefish have actually been beating the bass here because the squid's been arriving so early. So the squid usually shoots in, makes the rounds, gets through the inlet, and gets over by Rough Riders. Once the squid is in Rough Riders, you know the bluefish are coming. And the bluefish have been coming in earlier. The first shot at your bass are always going to be over by Ditch Plains. Small bucktails is always what it's going to be. 1/2 ounce, 3/8, maybe up to 3/4. you would think by then they should be stretching into the south side, but for whatever reason, normally the south side is still pretty quiet at that point until the bluefish show up. Again, I bring back the bluefish because the bluefish are so important to the bass fishery out here. A lot of people don't understand that, and I know they don't understand that, but that's okay. Until the bluefish arrive, the bass are just simply not going to really start taking off. Once they start clobbering them in the lake, the squid starts to exit, and once the squid is leaving, that's generally when you start seeing bigger bass, which is normally around the first week of May. And in the first week of May, the second week of May, through the third week of May, you're going to start seeing them feeding on different sized sand eels or anchovies, depending on what's around at the time. Smaller tins and smaller bucktails are always going to take the fish at that point. And it's right around then when they start setting up on the south side. It's tough to figure out which points that they're going to start setting themselves up in. But generally, you've got enough rock piles between the town beaches and the south side to have all kinds of bait. You've got small stone crabs, you've got small squid, you've got all kinds of small white bait. You've got a lot of different types of bait that the bass are going to set up on. And by June, the bigger fish are coming. By the June moon, generally, the bigger bait starts showing up, the bigger fish start to show up. July, which is my favorite month of the year, always, hands down, July is my favorite month. By then, you know you've got the big bait. You know you've got the big fish. You've got up and down the south side. And generally, it's an eel bite or a super strike darter bite. And at dawn, you got a real good shot with pencil pop. I never have any kind of time in August, and my guys never really do either. There's a few, you pick a few here and there, until that first northeast rolls in. And then, when that first northeast rolls in, usually followed by a hurricane, and again it happened this year, you have the hurricane, within 6 or 7 days, there's going to be a hard northeast blow. It always happens that way. After that first northeast is when the bait really starts moving. The mullet starts leaving. If you have any peanuts in the bay, they start moving out. If you have any kind of decent sized bait, it all starts exiting through the inlet, out the channel, and around, and it goes all over the north side. And then you start picking them on the south side. And the resident big fish that are on the south side start to get a little stirred up just because it started to blow a little bit. So September and October is really when it goes, and that's why a lot of guys decide to just simply fish September and October and ignore the rest of the season, which is kind of foolish because the biggest fish you're ever going to catch is almost always going to be in June and July. Almost always. Almost. Years ago when I first started coming out here, my first night out was actually Halloween night, and at that time, in the late 80s and the early 90s, November was the month to be here. November, you had to be out here with big yellow darters and the Musso Super Strike. Again, I know I constantly stress that, but that's what it was. The big yellow darter just destroyed fish in November. The last few years, November has been a bust. The herring run has been a lot later. The herring hasn't been showing up until around the first or second week of December. It hasn't even been showing up by Thanksgiving. Usually by Thanksgiving weekend, it would start to slow down a little bit, and the only fish that were around were the last stragglers, and they were big fish most of the time. But lately, I would say the last 10 or 12 years, November has just been really, really kind of quiet. And I'm hoping for a late season this year since it started so late, you know? You know, there are some places where you have to have proper equipment to fish. The lighthouse being probably the most dangerous place you can fish out here. It may not be as bad as, Orient, the jetty out there, but the lighthouse can be a real tough place to fish. You've got to be prepared to fish it. You got to be ready to go down into the rocks and get your fish out, because you cannot high stick a fish out of the rocks under the lighthouse. You've really got to climb down and get your fish out of there. And if you're not wearing the proper equipment, it can be deadly, at least deadly. I mean, crippled is one thing. Dead, no problem. Crippled, nobody wants to be crippled, man, So you got to be prepared, man. I mean, you got to have spikes. You got to have you don't necessarily need a wetsuit. Anybody that knows me knows that I tell everybody the same thing. Waders, a good top, and a belt around your waist is really what you got to have. More importantly, you got to have protection on your feet, because the rocks are just so slippery up on the north side and the south side and under the light. I mean, they're just slippery everywhere. So you got to be really prepared to fish the light. It can get very tough up there, but it could also be the most productive place that you can possibly fish, at times. There's other times where if you're standing at Jones's on a northeast, and there's just a couple of certain spots where if you're standing at Jones's and you're not on top of something, you're going to take it in the guts and in the ball sack every freaking time, boy, and that can hurt, man. That can hurt a lot. If you're fishing it at the right time, you can get clobbered pretty good. But the lighthouse is very dangerous, and if you're not prepared for it, then you really, really, really shouldn't be fishing there,